Hello and welcome to the Helpful for Life morning show. The show where we keep saying we're going to change the name, but we don't.
That's yeah, well, I guess we've had a long weekend. We've pondered probably, I don't know, 150 names.
Yeah.
So, at this point, we're just waiting for you, the viewer, to actually come back and tell us what we should call the show.
Yes. And so, yes, please add in the comments, or if you know one of us personally, reach out and say, hey, you should really name it this or you should really name it that. And, I'm glad that we brought up the viewer because this week, that's one of the biggest things that I'd like to do with this show is start to engage with the viewer some more. Both we're going to put out some prompts a little later. Hope maybe today, no promises, but yeah, put out some prompts to some things that people might have questions around, and then we're gonna do our best to answer them. And anything that we're not able to answer, we'll get back to you.
Yeah, right. And, maybe in 2 or 3 weeks, but we'll get back to you for sure. Yeah,
At some point, maybe next year, but
Right.
we'll get back to you. It is getting close to the holidays, so maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. It might be, Q2 of 2022. Yeah.
But yeah, so just real quick, since we just wanted to give you a spotlight. But no, I did also want to say,
Oh, the hair.
oh, the hair. So in case we forgot to say it earlier on, I am Reed Garcia, the founder of Helpful for Life.
This is Ryder Richards, random dude on the
Random
show.
dude. Yes, found him outside. And what this show is about is starting your morning off right. We want to give you guys something to maybe be a part of your morning routine as you're waking up, getting started, or maybe you're on the road, or maybe you listen to this at any other time, right? Because it's recorded, but it's live 7:30 to 8:30 a.m. Central Time. Every weekday for now. We're not going to keep up every day forever because that might kill us. But
Honestly, we're just not that interesting.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like cup's empty.
Yep. I was actually nervous about that this weekend. I was like, I wrote that down. I was like, I think it took me like 5 years to build up all the insights I dumped into the first week.
So you heard it here first. Go watch those last 5 episodes and be like, wait, those are all writers' insights.
That's all you got in 5 years. Yeah.
No. Hopefully that's not the case, but we'll find out. And again, as a reminder, Ryder is here at will employment, aka not being paid. So guess what? You'll fire you if you run out of ideas.
Yeah, no, I know. Thank you. It was nice just sucking the marrow out of your soul.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad that you brought up sucking the marrow out of your soul. What could be a better transition? So today we're going to talk about a couple of things, and then we might change topics as things pop into our head. But a couple of things that we want to make sure to talk about today are the downsides of habits and productivity, and one of the reasons why we are so conscious about failing forward here and not being too worried about perfecting everything right away. So that'll be one of the main topics for today.
Yeah, we've kind of touched on it previously that yes, the show is freshly underway and we're figuring it out as we go. And there's a lot of advice out there. I mean, even guys like philosophers like Slavoj Žižek, he'll say that he would never finish a book if he actually thought he was writing a book. So part of his trick to get himself going is just to get started writing some ideas down. So he just tells himself one thing, and then it ends up becoming something else. So sometimes there's these little tricks you can do for productivity, but part of it is these sort of behavioral hacks. And so that's kind of one part. We're going to maybe talk a little bit about how the human brain works. I think one of the other things we're kind of interested in is everyone seems to be self-optimizing all the time now. And we talk about things like habit stacking, and there is like a seduction in that, in becoming all you can be, right? Maximizing your potential, all these kind of things. And I think we're just kind of wary of that at a certain extent. Yes, it's fantastic if you can kind of keep larger priorities in mind.
Yeah, and it is that constant mix of keeping the larger priorities, keeping different things in check, and also the long term versus the short term, and prioritization of tasks and things like that. And it ties in very well. A lot of people view it through the lens of themselves and their productivity, but it also goes very well for larger productivity of an organization or a company or something like that. And especially in the entrepreneurship world, I mean, that's one of the biggest things that I struggle with, and I didn't use past tense because I still struggle with it, is prioritization and deciding what is the most important thing to be working on right now. Because it's very easy to do. I don't know if you've heard this term before, productive procrastination. But I'm actually an expert in that. PhD.
Wait, that doesn't make sense.
I know it doesn't make sense.
Or are you being productive at procrastinating?
Well, yes, you are. But you're doing something productive as a form of procrastination. And so probably one of the most common examples, both just in general, but especially in my life, is cleaning. If you need the house to get cleaned, give me some sort of deadline or something that I don't really want to do.
Yeah, hey, Reed, we need a name for the show.
Yeah. Okay, you did notice my apartment was a little dirty coming in here, so yeah.
No, I do like that idea, though, right? Because you get to sort of jump ship, right? And say, well, I am working right now, so
Right.
it's okay.
Right, and it's like I'm doing something good, right? And cleaning is a interesting example because it is something that's inherently for personal versus work. But don't get yourself. There's plenty of productive procrastination that you're probably doing every day while you're at work. And I think probably one of the more common examples of that is email or chat.
Oh, yeah, there is this kind of crazy thing. Like, I talk to people on occasion who talk about how many emails they get per day and that they are desperately trying to keep that inbox at zero. Like, they're really working hard at answering every email. And I have to think to myself, do you really have to answer every email?
Yeah. Now, this idea of intentional incompleteness, and both on the consuming and on the producing or creating side, is an interesting one. And we're here on the creating side, getting you as incomplete as possible. But yeah, I mean, and we'll talk a little bit more this episode as well about what that journey has been like for us over this last week and some of the things we've liked and didn't like and things we want to change. And of course, on that front, we want to hear from you. And that's actually how we've received some of these changes already, is from people coming to us and be like, hey, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that anymore. Or maybe do a little less of that. Or, oh, what was going on with that couch thing? Yeah, surprisingly, no one said that to me yet, but I just think no one's really seen it.
Yeah, that's the beauty of where we're at right now, is we're just throwing this out into the void. And 3 months from now, there's going to be some lashback on something, but we just won't know about it until we actually get our viewership up.
For sure. But back on that topic of incompleteness, this is one that I was exposed to probably, 6 weeks ago or something like that. And so we mentioned it maybe once before, but there's a software called Roam Research, and it's a digital notebook software, and it's extremely powerful. And I discovered it earlier this year, I believe, in the January timeframe roughly, and I've been using it now for I guess around 8 months, and I find it very, very amazing, and we'll talk more about that later. But I invited I invited Ryder to use that maybe 3 months ago, 2 months ago, something like that.
Yeah.
And the reason I bring it up is because one of the things that we've engaged with it is using being a part of what's called the Rome Book Club, which is a book club put on by volunteers, and it has some employees from Rome in there as well. But it's largely a lot of power users, but it's also a whole bunch of new users. And this last book club we did was on the book called How to Read a Book.
Right? Which at this point in time we started this book, it was How to Read a Book. And of course, one of the things being in these book clubs is this was like the 5th book club, and so all these people had already read books previously. And so they keep talking about how to take smart notes. And I'm like, wait, I'm reading a book on how to read a book, and now I need a book on how to take notes so I can know how to read this book. And it was just, I very much felt like sort of a dummy carrying these books around, like how to read.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's interesting. But one of the things about that book that I found really fascinating was one of the main points of it was, hey, you don't, and in fact, you shouldn't read every book cover to cover, and you really shouldn't even read every book. It's just like part of the process is go through that book really fast and then see if it's worth more of your time, which was kind of a shift, at least for me, on how to consume. And it goes back to that, that scarcity or that incompleteness, and how, yeah, it's okay to just do that real quick, figure out if it's worth before you dive in further, both on the create and the consume side.
Yeah, and I think in there they actually called that inspectional reading, right? And so they give you some frameworks of how to go through and inspect the high end points, right? Get all the peaks, and I mean, you don't have to get down into the weeds basically, but you can just hit the peaks. And what's kind of fun about that is to think that there are softwares as well today that help us with this. There's things like Blinkist and Lucid, and one of these guys that works on Rome a lot, Nat Eliason, has notes of books that he's taken, summaries. And when you can sort of find all these resources that are out there for you, I mean, do you ever really need to read a book? So, I mean, what would be the downside of not reading a book and only skimming the contents? I mean, maybe it's like getting a TED Talk on the book.
Right. And that's a topic in and of itself, so we won't dive all the way into that, but yeah, I mean that's part of what it is about. What is the value of consuming something for yourself versus having it regurgitated from somebody else? Well, I mean, for one, there's that translation, right? Every time it goes to another person, like for example, if you're telling me about a book that you read from a summary of Nat,
Yes.
then it's like, all right, well, there's value in going to that original source material, right? And that's both from just a pure like takeaway and value perspective, but especially when you get into things like, I don't know, complicated things like news and politics and religion and things like that. It's like, well, I want to get to the original source to see what they said in their words, without anyone putting their spin, their bias, any of that on top of it. So that's at least one of the things that you lose from not getting it yourself. But then there's also, especially with a lot of nonfiction books, especially ones that are, say, about business or self-improvement or something like that, anyone where they're trying to help you receive some sort of transformation yourself, not too unlike a lot of the things that we teach here at Helpful for Life. Part of the value is not just in like learning that one thing, but it's going through and seeing those other examples of that concept in real life. Like, oh, that's what it could look like. Oh, and by the way, each one of those little stories or examples, and I'll admit, there's definitely some books where you're like, okay, yet another story or example. I mean, come on.
Right. And can you get to the point already?
Right.
Yeah, I finished one the other day, and every paragraph starts with some sort of story, anecdote, something. And I know those are good and they stick, but I also think we were talking earlier about the trap of habits, and we could at some point also talk about the trap of storytelling.
Right.
Because you instantly sort of embody the characters. And so whatever happens throughout the narrative, you're sort of bought into that point of view, and the story unfolds for you. And there's a kind of passivity to that that can really kind of suck people in. But anyway, that's just something else completely. And when we're sort of talking about these habits, so using things like Rome Research and also doing this book club, like you are not only learning a software, but you're also sort of talking with really smart people, and you're learning these books. And a lot of these people are volunteers. Almost all of them are volunteers doing this. And there's a lot of time and energy that is pumped into these kind of things. And we were talking previously about just, I don't know, joining something like this book club and sinking in time every day into it and building that into your daily habit or your daily routine and turning it into a habit. There's something that can be kind of transformational about that.
Yes, there is. And, for the record, this was my first book club I'd ever done in my life, much less one that was done in this way. And again, one of the cool things about doing this book club with this digital notebook is that we actually all shared one common notebook that we worked together in, and it didn't go perfectly, naturally, and it was a learning process as we were going, but that was also some of the nature of it, and it was really cool to be doing that. And yeah, I mean, it was people all over. It's probably one of the most geographically diverse groups of people that I've worked with. It's like, oh, there's this guy over in the UK, this guy in Germany, this guy in Africa, this guy over, wherever. They were kind of all over the place. But one of the things that Ryder and I were talking about this morning before we turned the cameras on was how we've learned and read and heard so much about productivity and habits and things like that. But we found ourselves reflecting, like, not that many people warn about the downsides of going down that path, and especially if you start to go too far or something like that. And that's actually one thing that this How to Read a Book they actually did address a little bit of, because one of the things we're talking about is doing more and more, and even right before we turn the mics on, you're like, oh, I'm starting to do more compound workouts, so I can so I can work out more than one part of my body at the same time. Compress efficiency.
Yeah, this is so funny. Like if you start factoring optimization into every part of your life, right? You're all of a sudden you're just like, well, if I'm gonna go to the gym, which workouts work out more muscles all at once so I can get a better workout quicker,
Right.
And this all for me seems to have started when I read 4-Hour Work Week, the Tim Ferriss book, right? Where if you set all these systems up and optimize all these things, well, then that's fantastic. But one of the things he points out in the book that a lot of people seem to forget is that you do that so that you can live a richer, fuller life in some other capacity.
Right.
But what I tend to see instead is that everyone hyper optimizes and then they go overboard being productive. So I was listening to Tom Bilyeu's impact theory the other day, and he was talking about working like, well, I usually get in about 92 hours a week of work. And I'm just like, that's just ridiculous. Like, I mean, at what point, that's what's funny is, yes, you're successful, but what is the cost of that?
Right.
And this is a guy who talks about habit stacking. He talks about all these things so he can be hyper productive. And there's a sort of prolificness to that. And I think there's a seductive trap in there of being super productive and then gauging yourself, your own value in the world, and always giving back value, always adding value. I find business people talk about this all the time, and I want to tell them that's a trap. Like this idea of always providing value and always doing more. And then, I mean, you start seeing burnout and you start seeing people that have breakdowns and you start seeing other problems. But I would also hazard to guess that a lot of productivity comes about when people are stuck at home during COVID. That was when I think for the first time I started just bumping into this notion of the self-optimizer and how much we need to be optimizing every moment of our day.
Well, you need to be is the strong word there, right? And that's kind of the trap that you fall into, is you feel that constant need to be doing more, need to be doing things faster, or what have you. And that's already on top of, especially here in America, that fact that we all come from that scarcity mindset. And then that can also be even stacked even further based off of what your background is. And, do you come from a place of scarcity? That's a common theme with people who come from lack of money, right? Even once they get more money than they'd ever need in their life, like they're still viewing it through that lens just because that's how essentially they're wired, right? And some people even recognize that's what they're doing, but just because you recognize it doesn't mean that you can necessarily change it, which is a perfect example of the whole problem, right? And the whole purpose of the habits and things like that.
Yeah, there's something that, talking about the scarcity mindset, I think it really draws together a couple of things. Like, we all know we're sort of living in a capitalist culture, and there's certain behaviors that end up getting championed and ingrained into us at a very, very early age, like developmental child psychology, that are very hard to unwind or unwire. And what one of these might be the idea that your value is through your productivity or your worth. And it isn't just by being a human, right? Which should be enough. Yeah. But no, it is that you must be able to achieve in certain realms. And so whenever somebody feels that they are not achieving and they're looking around for what they should do to achieve, there's certain kinds of advice that pop up on the internet. Be your best self, find your passion, these kind of things. And of course, are any of us programmed for that? Do we even know what our passion is? Because what I tend to find is people's passions are sometimes things like just being really productive and making a lot of money.
Right. And there are a lot of traps you can fall into as you start to find and look for those areas that, one, you could be more productive, two, they fall more in line with what you want to do. And also an interesting thing that comes up when you talk about this stuff is the differences amongst the generations, right? When, for example, with my generation versus my parents, my parents very much came up with the find that career, and you're pretty much going to stay in that career for a while, if not the whole career, right? And the generation before them, it was basically one career forever. And then there's the aspect of retirement, and then at some point you'll never work, right? And then now more and more people are brushing up against that and being like, well, I don't really think retirement is something I want to do because I don't want to sit around or whatever. So yeah, it brings up a lot about that type of thing.
Yeah, there's a book that I read maybe a year and a half ago at this point, and it's called Moral Mazes by Robert Jackow. And he's a sociologist who goes and maps out how middle managers operate in massive corporations. When I say massive, we're talking 50 to 200,000 employees or something like this. Which is not your typical startup or entrepreneurial activity. But what's really kind of fascinating is to sort of map out how everyone gives sort of credence to the Protestant work ethic. That's Max Weber's he's one of the first sociologists to really sort of mix in some of these ideas. But it talks about a couple of things. One of them is bureaucracy and the trap that bureaucracy creates. But originally bureaucracy was to stabilize states. So they pulled bureaucracy from the military, stabilized states by involving it within the populace. And what that allowed is the stabilization allowed for finance. So when we start looking around at companies that operate through something like heavy bureaucracies, and the one funny thing about the sort of pyramid of bureaucracy where everyone knows their position and they're in it so it feels very stable, is that you also sort of weed out productivity, which is strange because we will give a lot of credence to the Protestant work ethic about working all the time for productivity. But what kind of happened at some point too is that the Protestant work ethic changed the way that money operated into your value could be seen through your portfolio, through your index of wealth that meant that you were chosen, you were one of God's chosen. So that kind of stripped the productivity out, but we still had to give credence to it to sort of form Protestant values. So what's kind of strange in the companies now is that the higher up you go, then the more right you are, the more righteous you are. And
Interesting.
yeah, it was just kind of a really interesting book to sort of map out how there was a lot of lip service given to a lot of values. But one of the things they found was that the people who stayed at work the longest, whether or not they were productive, were seen to be hard workers, and being seen or perceived as a hard worker, being seen as productive simply by the hours you put in, was more valuable in a company than actually being productive or smart.
Well, and just to acknowledge, we're shifting a little bit from the habit and the productivity a little bit to the career, and it's this overlap naturally.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think the reason for your last point, which was that, and at least at this time, and I would argue it's still in some places, and especially the outward visibility of work versus the actual value versus the perceived value, those are all very different.
Yes.
And I think the reason is because that actually requires a little bit of work and or deeper understanding on the other person, right? Whether that be a coworker or a boss or whatever. Like, one of the fears a lot of people have is, I'm going to get fired. If they think I'm doing nothing, all these types of things. And yes, for some of people, yeah, maybe that's true. But for most people, guess what? That boss probably isn't thinking about you nearly as much as you are, especially if they've never talked with you and said, hey, we're having issues. Because guess what? They probably have other people that they have issues with. They probably have issues with themselves. They probably have other issues with themselves, especially if there's one of these people who's working 90 hours a week. And then, and they're probably not watching you all the time and not knowing how much you're doing and all those types of things, right?
Right. We're probably not the center of their focus, and that's probably good for us. I think there's a couple of little things in there. One of the reasons I think I was bringing this up and that you touched on there was that this problem of productivity, a lot of the habits we have now or that we're told to have are, of course, based around productivity. They're based around ways to hack your productivity to become more useful to, get to the next level. And whatever that level is, it's like we're all playing a video game and we need to all level up and get to the boss fight. And it's really kind of funny to think about, but if you don't know why you're doing something, why are you doing it? I saw it, and we talked about this the other day. I saw a tweet that was like, well, how are you ever going to become a billionaire if you don't take cold showers?
Right.
Right. It's because what we do is sort of misplace why we're doing something with the habits of the wealthy or successful. So there's a lot of behavioral economics and behavioral science out there right now that can tell us these are the things that will help you in certain ways. And you kind of have to wonder, if you mimic the behavior, do you become that person? Or do you have to be the person to implement the behavior?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I want to get back to the why. So let's have that be kind of the next segment that we talk about here in a second. But I do want us to make sure that we address one of the things that the main reason we brought this up, right, is that dark side, is the areas where people can go into and the traps that people can fall into, right? And we talked about it a little bit last week, but the idea of you set some ideal for yourself or some goal, right? And then you are performing by definition below that. And there's always that gap where you are, quote unquote, failing the entire time until you achieve that thing. And the phrase "fat and happy," or it's like, "Hey, I don't know, I don't care. Like, I'm living a great life." I mean, there's some credence to that, but I guess why would I care about all this productivity stuff when I've gotten along just fine in my life? Why should somebody care?
Yeah, that's a good point. I honestly can't tell you why they should, because I think for everyone, of course, it will be slightly different. But there's the other things that I can bring up about myself, the reasons that I feel certain ways. I feel like there is some potential that I have not been able to tap.
Yeah.
I feel like, and this is a broad form of like fear of missing out, but it's fear of missing out on myself.
Yeah. Well, and this ties very well in with the why, because in my opinion, you get to that why, you get to that base understanding of what is your why, which, by the way, is not like a 0-1 thing. It's not on or off. Like, you don't instantly figure it out and then have it for the rest of your life. I think that's one of the common myths, right?
That's a huge myth, and I fall into it all the time.
Yeah.
It was like, when I was 20, I wrote a list of goals of what I wanted to do by the time I was 40. But by the time I'm 40, I'm a different person.
Right. And you care about completely different things and
Yes.
have completely different goals and all sorts of things. But yeah, so that continual quote unquote failing is sort of hard to deal with. Oh, one quote that came into my mind, and I think I saw this on a sticker somewhere. I've probably heard it a couple of other times too. But again, this whole what should I be versus what I am, or what am I trying to achieve versus what I am achieving now. It's something very present in my mind as an entrepreneur, and both with this company and other ideas and things that I have in my mind. But one of these things I saw was a parable of a guy who, let's just say he's a tourist, right? And he goes to this island in the Caribbean or in Mexico or something like that, and he sees some guy coming in with his boat, and he's like, "Wow, you got a lot of fish there." He's like, "Yeah, it's a good amount of fish." He's like, "This will be enough, to feed me and my family for the rest of the week." And he's like, "Cool. So what do you do now? What do you do now?" He's like, "Oh, I go hang out, have a siesta, hang out with my family, spend some time, maybe fish just for fun." He's like, "Oh, well, you could get a bigger boat, and then you could hire some people, and then you could, scale into a multinational corporation. You could ship all over the world." And then he's like, "Well, why would I want to do that?" "Well, then you could go to an island and just spend time with your family and just go fishing."
Yeah, right.
And I botched it a little bit, but you get the
No,
concept.
yeah. The concept is that the thing that you were doing every day that you were already enjoying, you're enjoying a simple life because you had simple pleasures. But instead, we all need to work our ass off, undergo a whole lot of stress, be super productive for the economy and everyone around you, get the, praise of all your peers. And only then can you actually go enjoy the simple things that you were enjoying already. Yeah, it's a very kind of fun and poignant story that just talks a lot about sort of our, I don't know, how indoctrinated we are for these ideas of success. This
Right.
idea that we don't know, oh, you're doing something and you're enjoying it. Let's scale that up. Let's turn that into a product.
Yeah.
This is just how we do everything.
For sure. So let's just briefly talk about what this has looked like for us within this show, even, and caution people on some of the traps that they can fall into. And then let's move over to that why discussion and talk about a little bit about what that means for you, what that's meant for me, and also some of the things that we teach here at Helpful for Life. And we'll get into a little bit of that. But let's talk about this show. So this last week, for those of you who aren't aware, this is our second week. It's episode 5. It's technically the 6th one that we've done because we called our first one episode 0. It was partially because we were like, oh, we're still figuring some things out. And, now in hindsight, as a nerd, electrical engineer, computer guy, I could say we always start counting with 0 in the digital world. So, you can have whatever excuse you want. But yeah, last week was an interesting challenge for me. I mean, I've never done anything like this, at least at this scale. I've certainly given a couple live presentations, been on a couple podcasts and things like that. Of course, we can put links in the description for that. And for those of you who aren't aware, which is probably most of you because I don't think we've mentioned it yet, Ryder has a podcast of his own. Just give a quick tidbit on that.
Yeah, it started about a year and a half ago. Started doing a podcast. It's called Let Us Think About It. And it originally had a different title, which was The Will to DIY. And ended up talking with a marketing person who was like, that's just way too complicated. And she was actually correct. I was being very clever and making a lot of references that no one got. And then people would be like, well, this isn't about DIY at all, because it was about DIY of the self. And so the idea that you could somehow fix yourself. And so that's how it kind of got started, is me thinking about things, reading things, just trying to dig into not only self-help, but philosophy and how we can work on the world and this impulse. What I'm really drawn to is the DIY impulse, which is something that I think Reed and I are both tackling here as well. So when we keep talking about failing, but part of that is by trying. If you don't actually get off your butt and do something,
right,
then you'll never get to that degree of like proficiency or mastery.
Right. And that's one of the things that we've talked about a couple times. I'm sure will come up many times again, but that produce versus consume, or making versus consuming, and creating versus consuming. We don't think you only need to create, and we want to make sure you don't fall into the trap of creating too much. But if you're only consuming, then just at least reflect and see, hey, how does this relate to your why? But for one more time, what was the name of your podcast?
Oh, Let Us Think About It.
Let Us Think About It with Ryder Richards. So we'll eventually get a link sometime within the next few years in the description.
Right. But coming back to this show and us trying it out and sort of going meta on it, which is fun, as if like I keep thinking about like how we did this show and what we did, and of course we're both sort of the type of people who get analytical about things, and we start thinking about them and trying to process that information so we can better ourselves.
Right.
And one of the things that we talked about on Friday was both of us were like, oh my God, I am wiped.
Right.
Just completely wiped out.
Yeah.
And so there was a physical state that we were going through that started for me, I think, Wednesday. And it just lasted through Friday, where I was just somewhat exhausted.
Yeah. And that was a great transition for me to go into the weekend, because I was going into the weekend, I was like feeling good, I was on fire. I was like, oh, this show, there's plenty of things we can fix, which we'll talk a little bit about, but like I'm feeling pretty good overall, because last week our show was pretty much improvised, which was really cool, and the technical went pretty well overall. And then on Friday we decided to all right, let's throw in all of these different things: new musician, new mic setup, new clock thing on the computer, new software.
Yeah, had our digital guest come on. We got to see what the lag and latency was, what the programs could handle.
Yeah, and this whole concept of just doing it and trying the thing, and then learning that way, versus the opposite of which is what I'm more likely to do, especially when it comes to my company, is research the crap out of something and then share. And it's like there's value to both approaches, but there's nothing, talk about efficiency. There's nothing to say that we'd learned so much within that hour that would have taken tens of hours probably to figure out each of those things individually on their own.
Yeah, and there's that's kind of this other side about being open that we have in the show, which is actually kind of hopefully going to lead us to feedback loops that are quicker. We get quicker, we get instantaneous turnaround. This is one of the things that is brought up in books like Atomic Habits. It's brought up in How to Take Smart Notes, the earlier book that we're talking about, and Sonka Aaron's book. But yeah, one of the things about this is that you need sort of instantaneous feedback to grow from it. There's some other fascinating things about how to learn better too. Doing it through collaborators is a lot faster learning process than even asking yourself questions.
Right. Yeah. And that, especially with anything that has to do with creative, just having something to bounce back and forth. Right. But yeah, and just to give a couple of the specific examples of things, had our first what are you doing live moment when I tried to show the fact that Lincoln was doing the butt scratch, and then I was like, okay, this is how it progressed in my mind. Like, all right, I want to show what this butt scratch looks like, but the cameras are such to where I can't be elevated enough. So then I decided to stand on the couch to then demonstrate the butt. And then ended up looking like I was humping you. And I was like, oh, right in the middle of it. It was,
that was why I was so exhausted, I think, on Wednesday.
But yeah, this has been good. And another thing to be balanced is what level of conversation do we have? Both one from like all right, let's talk about these sources that we've got and these names and these titles and things like that. One, because we want to reference them, and especially for people who want to dig in them some themselves and have that be a part of the discussion. Versus how much of a layman terminology we use. Talking as if anyone could understand, and they don't have to worry about getting confused and things like that. And then also on the humor side of things is like, hey, how do we ride this line between professional and business, and also just like everyday dudes, right? And especially when we're trying to present ourselves as somewhat of an authority, it's this interesting balance.
Yeah, and I think part of this is knowing that our authority is tenuous at best, right? It's more along the lines of a willingness to continue learning. I think more than anything else, we have a willingness to be pointed out that we're wrong, sort of an openness to that, but all in the name of improving over time. And so part of it is kind of intentions, and of course we want to see how that plays out. One of the things that we're talking about, though, is that sort of criticality and that sort of looking at moments and going like, is that good? Is that something to do in the future? Is that something to remove in the future? And there is something about that sort of awareness that I think feeds into this habit trap that we were talking about earlier, is of course you want to be better at this. Like we were talking about, doing compound exercises at the gym. If you're going to go to the gym and you know that doing a certain movement will help your body out more, it'll get your heart rate up quicker, well then why aren't you doing that thing? You should be doing that thing. And then you go, oh, and then there's a 20-minute window, which is the best time to take BCAAs and protein and creatine afterwards, which your body does like a super absorption thing because it's hungry for that kind of sugars and proteins and nutrients. Yeah. And so you just kind of start going, once you have that knowledge in your head, it's really hard not to follow through on it.
Right.
Like you actually feel like you have missed an opportunity, like you have lost out if you did not. Say you went to work out, you did a workout without any compound exercises, and you didn't take protein afterwards. Well, then you just start going, well, I probably just shouldn't have even gone.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least then you're burning calories thinking about how much you're beating yourself up, right?
There we go.
But yeah, no, that is the trap, right? Is you can see all of the things that are possible, and then the solution largely is, hey, recognize and be okay with that you're not going to hit that all the time. Even after you're quote unquote peak human, say you've been doing this for 10, 20 years, living intentionally, habit stacking, doing all these types of things, guess what? You're still going to fall short. You're still going to make mistakes. You're still going to be doing all these wrong things. And honestly, that's how I want it. I mean, remember, we're human after all, right? Like we don't want to go too far to the robot aspect, and you don't want to go too far to the too busy side, because again, that's where you start to lose some of the value of what you're doing in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of loving your routine. Your routine can very easily become a replacement for life itself. And you can call it living, but it's not actually living, right? You're an automaton at some point. So I don't know exactly how you gauge that. You should probably be talking to your loved ones around you. By the way, have I become a robot?
Yes, that's probably a good check. But yeah, and then also, there are cycles, right? And just accept, like, there's going to be some weeks where you're killing it, you're firing on all cylinders, you're doing all the things, and there's going to be other ones where you're stooping real low. And that actually, when you are stooping real low, that can be one of the times where having that structure is still enabling you to do some things, to get some productivity things done, and to say, hey, I'm not my best right now, I'm not fully there, I'm not, my mind's elsewhere, I'm exhausted, whatever, some dude just humped me. You're down low, but you're still able to get that output because of the systems you've put into place. So that's pros and cons, right?
There are, and then one of the things that we haven't touched on a whole lot yet, but one of the, let's call it a benefit of having these habits and having these routines, is when you go through something like depression, one of the things that pulls you out of it can be productivity routines. Just getting out and moving sometimes is a big enough struggle. So one of the things they heavily recommend for depressed people are things like working out, keeping a journal, like having processes that you do on a daily basis that can sort of help you not only engage with the world, but have something you do that makes you productive or lets you feel that way. And so some of these are really empowering tendencies. So that was one of the things when I was going through COVID and was starting to get really bummed out. Well, then I started looking around on what you can do for yourself cognitively that can help you dig yourself out of feeling that sort of sadness or ennui or whatever the heck it is. And one of them is to have these great habits.
Yeah.
And so you start doing the habits, you start feeling better, you start relying more on the habits. And then we keep talking about habit stacking, and we haven't really clarified maybe what that is, but y'all probably already know. It's one of those things that I originally came across, and once again, this Tom Bilyeu and impact theory was talking about doing meditation and what happens to your brain when you meditate. You sort of zone out through fMRI technology. They've really seen that there's certain parts of your brain that go sort of dormant, and that opens up other capacities in your brain, and so your kind of hyperabsorption is there right afterwards. So if you went from doing meditation into something like reading, you would absorb more information. If you went straight into something like journaling, you might have a more clear idea of what's going on because you've cleaned some of that sort of rambling detritus out of your head that's always distracting you. So there's ways to stack two habits together to get more than either one of them alone will give you.
Yeah, and so that is I will call like a level 2 type of habit stack. I'll start with a very basic level 0, level 1. Let's think about something that people should be doing every day. And I don't use the word should often. I'm careful about it. But I think science says you should be brushing your teeth every day, right? So that's one habit that people should have.
What do they know?
At least once a day, if not multiple. But that is a very natural thing to stack habits on top of. Whether it's brushing your teeth, whether it's making your coffee, whether it's doing your meditation, whether it's taking someone to school, whatever it is where you have some sort of habit already or routine that you're doing every day, every week, whatever frequency you want, simply take another habit, something else that you want to do, and you stack it on it. You add that to it. So now, okay, every time I brush my teeth, I also take a vitamin. Or every time I brush my teeth, I also do a single curl. So I get my workout in for the day.
Right,
you know?
right. With a tube of toothpaste.
With the tube of toothpaste, yeah. But so yeah, I mean, there's so much we could talk about habits and routines and things like that. But the main takeaway I have for that is, be realistic. Remember the fact that you're a human, and if you are looking to self-improve. But by the way, another trap of that whole improvement productivity thing is always looking for the next optimization, right? It's like, let me optimize my optimizing.
Yes. And what's so funny about that is you can spend all day setting up your habits and your optimization and never really pull back out of that.
For sure.
You can stay deep within there, and there's a comfort there. And what's... I don't know if I want to go off on this tangent too much, but there is something about gaming and control and agency and autonomy that can come out of doing things like playing a video game, messing with software, organizing things, right? You're not actually being productive in the outer world, but there's kind of a self-soothing where there's a perfect contingency that happens there where your mind and your hands relate and you feel productive because, once again, productive procrastination, you are active. And so this is one of those little traps that we can fall into quite easily. And here's the thing. It's never a trap maybe if you're aware of it.
Yes.
That's not true.
I said yes immediately. I was like, wait,
never say never.
Be careful with the trap as you fall into it. It's still a trap.
But this is my favorite trap. I love this trap.
Yes, but I will say step 1 is to be aware of it, right? And then if you fall in the trap of falling for traps multiple times, recognize, okay, hey, I'm realizing that those really smart dudes, Reed and Ryder, they said, watch out for this thing, and now it's happening.
Yeah.
Okay, now what, right? And so the first step is to be self-aware that it's happening, and then the next step is changing the habit or the routine or whatever to make sure that you aren't falling into that trap. And then maybe you need to change your environment. Maybe you need to change the habit you're stacking it with. Maybe you need to change how you're being held accountable. There's a lot that you may want to change about it, but I do want us to move on, because again, we could talk about this forever. But keep a good mindset. Make sure you're realistic and accepting the fact that you're not going to always meet it, and know that, hey, if you're thinking about this now and you're putting the intentions in now and you're trying to set up now things that make you better, well, guess what? You're going to be moving forward on a whole. And any one day you're failing, guess what? You're still better than you were the first time, just by the fact that you're thinking about it and you're working towards it. And then worst case, just move to that island and go hang out with that Mexican guy and making fish and have a good time.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting thing. We keep talking about habits as if you're supposed to be adding all of them on.
Right.
But there is the opposite.
Yeah, taking that is a big step. Is before you try and add things on, reflect on what maybe you should take away. So there will be plenty more discussion to be had on habits and productivity, and maybe even some things outside of the show. I'm sure there will be. It's just a matter of time. But before we talk more and more about that, let's recenter and talk about the why. So let's start out with you, Ryder. I mean, what is that drive or search for purpose or why or whatever, however you want to describe it? What does that look like for you?
Oh man, yeah, that's kind of a messy question, because it starts really getting into the psychology of things. I have some sort of idea that I'm reading a lot of things. I try to be aware of things. We talked briefly about this previously, Reed, but trying to do. There's two types of reading according to Eve Sedgwick, and one of them is reparative and one of them is paranoid. A lot of times people do paranoid reading because they're trying to figure out the world. The world is uncontrollable. They don't have any agency within it, and they're trying to find a way to sort of figure it out. And so that's when, during the pandemic, and even before that, I think after Trump was elected, then I started, and I have family that, voted for Trump, and I started going like, there is something going on here that doesn't jive in my mind, and I'm just really curious about it. So I started doing paranoid reading. I was reading a bunch of stuff that was trying to prove to me why the world functioned the way it functioned, and along the way there starts to become, I don't know, you can get quite cynical about the world.
Yeah.
But part of this is you want to be productive. You want to know your place in the world. You want to find out how you fit in. So all those impulses were coming in through me. I also had a new job at the time and was jumping through some different kind of hoops and trying to learn some things there. And some of this comes in with, who the hell am I? Like this big existential question. And then the other part is, what can I do about this? So I also started doing what is called reparative reading, where it's reading for self-help, taking on things like trying to do meditation, looking into things that can actually kind of reground you with the world and that could refix you in it. So spending time in nature, something like that. And what I'm kind of doing through all of these multiple habits is trying to like recenter who I am, that is outside of some of these kind of externalities that keep sort of showing up,
the labels,
buffering me and battering me, and it's all this kind of stuff.
Like some guy or co-host or dude or artist.
Oh God, no, I don't identify with any of those.
DIYer.
Yeah. Oh well, that.
But not that kind of DIYer, but also that kind of DIYer.
I'm all kinds.
Both kinds of DIYers. No, this is definitely one of those cases where it's like, all right, 5 jokes in, you probably need to backtrack and remember what the heck you were about to transition to.
Oh, yeah. It's, well, one of the things too is like, I know, Reed, that you have a tendency to consume a lot of media, dig into a lot of things. You are an entrepreneur, so part of your, how you live is based around developing products and ideas and things like that. So, I know that you have some habits you work on as well.
Yeah. Well, and, the interesting thing, again, with this whole create versus consume, it can't be really understated how much of a balance that is important for me, because like my job is to literally help other people figure out ways to live their lives better. Sure, that's more productively. That's also more purposely, and helping them with all these other things that they don't either realize that they need help with. And in some cases they do, some cases they don't. And then also the things where maybe they deep down know, but they don't outwardly admit it, or maybe they even know they need it, but they still have that resistance, right? For example, it's like, hey, you should brush your teeth, one time a day. And it's like, well, writer's like in his head, like, I know I should, but I'm not going to. I don't want to, and he maybe not even really understand why. But maybe it's deeply related with your childhood or whatever trauma history or whatnot, and maybe it's not. Maybe it's just you're a stubborn dude doesn't like to be told, and he's like, I know it's right, but
yeah. Oh man, a little side story here. I've got a friend who uses this weird device that like he doesn't go to the dentist, so he uses some weird device that like he puts to the side of his face that like kills bacteria in your mouth.
Okay.
And he's like, I don't know. It's very strange, but
interesting.
His teeth don't look great. But, but he's
the sample size of one, not great.
Right. But there's something about, well, if I kill all the bacteria, I'll be fine. It's the bacteria that kills you when you have bad teeth.
I bet he read a great article on that.
I'm sure. I wonder where he got it.
Yeah. No, but back to the purpose and meaning and discussion. So it's worth noting that, in my mind, you can't have this discussion without at least talking about religion and spirituality. And we're not going to give that any real justice here today. We're definitely going to have plenty of discussions of that in the future. Because, that's one of the main places people point to is, oh, well, for example, I'm a Christian and I do it all for God, and I'm doing the things with God's gifts to me, and I'm making the most use of them and things like that. And then there's also then there's that just reality check, which is regardless of whether or not you believe in God, it's like, are you really like hearing God every day who's telling you? And, depending on who you ask, some people will be like, yes, I am. And I'm not going to dispute whether or not that's true because there's no way for me to know. But then there's I'll say the vast majority who probably would say, no, I'm not. And I still have these questions. And yeah, that is my faith or my belief or whatever, whether it's Christianity or whatever. But I still need a little help in translating that into, all right, it's 7 a.m. I'm up. Where do I go now? What do I do?
Yeah.
But yeah, so one of the big things for me that I learned more and more about purpose and things like that. I mean, again, the first step is just taking a second and stepping back and then analyzing your situation, right? And that means, where are you at right now? Where are you headed? How did you get to where you are? And then, the important one that we're talking about is kind of, where do you want to be and where do you want to go and why, right? But it's so easy to get caught up in that day to day, in those habits, in those routines. And by the way, even if you haven't intentionally created habits and routines, you probably have a lot of habits and routines.
Yeah,
right?
Well, most of them we have are unintentional, right?
Yeah.
Plopping down on the couch at 7:00 to watch Netflix or whatever the heck it is. Like, that is also a habit, even though you haven't written it down and it's not on your schedule.
Right. And so one of the things is, as you're exploring and looking at and you're stepping out, recognizing this is an important one to me, is your purpose and your drive and your desire, that does not have to be tied to your career. Certainly, it can be great if they overlap and they happen to be the same thing, but they don't have to. And there's pros and cons of that when you do couple them and when you decouple them. But there's also just the fact that a lot of people don't have that ability or situation in life to be able to do that type of thing, or whatever it is, the thing that they are wanting to do. Maybe it just can't financially support their situation or whatever life that they want to live, whatever. So yeah, talk a little bit about what your thoughts are about decoupling that career and job aspect from the purpose.
Yeah, so as an artist, with my training in art, I have, a master's degree in painting, but mostly I do sculpture. I do some paintings and drawings still, but what ends up kind of happening for me along the way was realizing that trying to monetize my art was taking down me a path of being very formulaic, where I was going to end up creating pretty much, at one point I was doing I was igniting gunpowder to make drawings. And so a lot of people were liking these. I was starting to sell some of them. I was getting some gallery traction. Things were pretty good in that space. But I was then just being called, oh, the gunpowder guy. Right. And there's some other famous people that do gunpowder art. So I wasn't the only one. But that just became a label and a formula. And I just kept thinking to myself, this is not all I am. And so I ended up decoupling my art from money. And what's
for better or worse.
Yeah, for better or worse. I think it's better for the art. It might have been I don't know. I don't know if it's for worse or not, because the fascinating thing is it leads me into a lot of different territories. I think about things. I have a whole variety of creative practices now. I have skills that go across multiple disciplines because I didn't become specialized in one area. So I find myself to be maybe a richer, more interesting person, but that might just be hindsight bias. Who knows? But yeah, I think decoupling them, if you put too much pressure on that passion or that hobby and we try to monetize every aspect of our life, there's going to be times where all of it becomes work, where none of it is leisure, none of it is hobby, because everything is driven by the dollar.
Yeah, and which brings up another trap that a lot of times people fall into is like, oh, I've got my main job, that's what I do, but then on the side I do this thing, aka a side hustle, right? And a lot of times maybe it is something that starts out as art or video games or whatever, and it's like, this is the thing I do for fun, and then you start to say, well, I like doing that thing, and maybe I want to try and make a little bit of money from it, and then there's that whole shift of, oh, well, is it still fun? Is it still doing all those things for me, or does it become an issue or part of the problem?
Yeah, and these are huge questions that there isn't a binary on this. I think there's definitely a spectrum on these kind of things.
Right.
And that's okay. It's okay to sort of like drift through these or to try one out for a while. I think that's what's fascinating about careers now. We seem to be in a time that you mentioned this earlier, like our great grandparents, they found one job and they're loyal to it for the rest of their life.
And found is a strong word, right?
Right.
Today, in this day and age, it's like anything you want in life, you get to quote unquote choose, especially here in America, especially if you're of good socioeconomic class. Like, you could do, like, it couldn't be more true now than ever. You could literally do whatever you want to do. It's just a matter of time, and maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement, but you go with me here, right? Whereas back in the day is like, well, my father was a farmer, I was born on a farm, the stuff needed growing and cutting, I was a farmer.
Yeah. Or we've always worked for this one company. 52 years working for one company or something like that.
Especially if it's like, oh, I'm in a small town and that's the one company in town.
Yeah. Well, and then we've also bumped into, and this is discussed in Sandel's Tyranny of Merit, that the newer generation, because of the way they're trained in school, is very good at what we would call like superficial processing. So they're fantastic at nailing interviews, having all this knowledge. They interview great, they come across great, but then once they're in the job, not only are they not satisfied, but they don't really actually enjoy the job or like the job, so they end up changing jobs like shirts. And they exit rather than giving voice to complaint, because they haven't been taught how to complain or deal with confrontation, so they tend to, as Sandel says, they tend to exit.
Yeah, and that's not even to include those who do say something and then nothing happens.
Right. Yeah, and these are sort of some massive generational shifts. But when we start talking about hobby and career and finding your passion and all this stuff, it just sort of, I'm just like, oh boy, man, this is loaded jargon.
For sure. No, and again, one of the things that you said earlier, I want to make sure to point out, is this labeling and this outward appearance, right? And it's one of the, again, I'll call it a trap that we've fallen into, at least as Americans, is when you start meeting somebody, one of the first questions you ask them is, what do you do for work? And maybe not in that exact phrasing, but what do you do really is the more common, and that's implied, like, for work. And I myself am trying to shift away from that question. I still fail at it, and there's also times where, just by nature of what I'm doing, like, it is in my interest to at least at some point in the conversation figure out what you do. But yeah, like, one example of a slightly different shift is, what do you like to do for fun? Or what do you do in your spare time? Like, engage with someone on something where they're optionally engaging into it. And the downside of that is sometimes a lot of people are like, I don't know, or nothing.
Right. What do you mean? What is this fun you speak of?
Yeah. But that brings it to one other point around purpose. And again, we could go into this much longer than the time we gave ourselves allotted to. But I wanted to point this out, was being aware and accepting of the fact that it's up to you. It's up to you to decide what that is and what's okay, and not, as hard as it may be, eschewing, which is a fancy way of saying ignoring the people who are saying otherwise, right? Because, oh, you shouldn't do that because there's not enough money in that, or you can't do that because of XYZ. There's an infinite number of reasons, but recognizing the fact that, one, like we talked about, it does, your purpose and your passion, your fulfillment does not have to come from work. And another big point is making sure that you're doing it for yourself and not solely for others. Are there any other big top of mind points that come when it comes to purpose and passion and things like that?
No,
too?
I mean, the one that was in Wind Up Bird Chronicles was that it's okay to like fallow for a while. You do not always have to be pursuing something.
Yeah, which kind of goes hand in hand with what we were talking about earlier, the habits and the routines and things like that.
Yeah.
Like, you don't always need to be improving. You don't
Right.
always need to be doing that. And it's also worth noting, like, yeah, like a good way to think of life or your career or whatever is a series of sprints and jogs, right?
Yeah,
And, you know,
right.
it's like maybe right now, and so this will be kind of the personal challenge for today. Make today have a little bit of a sprint, right? Take whatever time you would like to take, but I would say at least start with 5, right, to get started, and then at the very least you've got started, and maybe it goes longer, maybe it doesn't, but take 5 minutes today and just look inwards and say, hey, where am I at in life? What am I going to do? What do I want to do? And what's my why, right? And that's kind of a lot to unpack, right? But just start that discussion.
And you know, to keep yourself on track, take notes.
Please
Jot it down.
Please write it down. At the
Take
very
action,
least,
yeah.
at the very least, record. Just pop open your phone, open a little voice memo, or you could use a software called Loom or Otter. They're free things you can download to. It'll automatically transcribe for you. But yeah, just get it outside of here, which is a huge thing that I don't think people really realize how big a difference that can make. But get it out of your brain and take that 5 minutes to look inwards. Any other closing thoughts from you, Ryder?
No, this has been a great show, Reed.
Yeah, I appreciate it. You know, there's nothing like a show where two guys can compliment themselves on how good the show went.
Yes. High five.
Yes. But yes, again, this week we really want to hear from you guys. So we'll be incorporating some direct feedback from you guys this week. And we will be asking you guys for questions on certain things. And we want to be engaging you both live. And then, of course, if you're not able to be here live or you'd rather not, just submit your questions and we'll give a little bit more info on how to do that later. But with that, this has been the morning show. I'm Reed.
This is Ryder.
And we'll talk with you guys later. Have a great day.